So language enables us to talk about events that aren't happening right here and now. Like body language, such as, the facial expressions you make or manual gestures. They only refer to what's happening right then and there. You can widen your eyes to show that you're surprised at something that's happening to you right now, and people will see your wide eyes and glean from that the meaning that you're surprised. But you can't merely widen your eyes to communicate more sophisticated ideas of maybe when you were surprised as a child or you were surprised reading something that morning. The mere widening of your eyes isn't going to cover those intricacies of meaning. So this property of language is called displacement, and that language, the words we use, can be used to refer to things outside of our immediate environment, whereas body language and animal communication, such as a cat arching their back when they feel that they're being threatened or are in danger due to the present situation they're in, language allows us to go beyond that, to talk about anything in space or time or out of it. We can talk about abstract concepts. Like imagine trying to contemplate on philosophy by just using body language and facial expressions. You're not going to get into any meaningful dialogue or be able to address issues in more complex ways. So for Crystal, that's the most remarkable property of language, in that it enables us to talk about virtually anything we want, even the things that don't exist. We can talk about war or love or mermaids or democracy or freedom because we have the words to do so and the meanings associated with them in our language. And if language ever lets us down by not immediately providing the words and sentences for us to describe or talk about something, then that introduces another property of language, and that language is productive. New meanings can be produced in language. New words can be introduced to adequately describe and give meaning to the things we want to talk about. And every day there's new words being added to the dictionary to better capture what's going on in our socially shared lives. And there's no limit to the number of words that can be in a language. It's not like Merriam-Webster is going to be, oh, we've hit the limit for the English language. No more words can be added. New words are being invented every day. By contrast, new body language expressions aren't being invented every day. There's no productivity in those modes of communication. You can't just add a new body language gesture to the lexicon of body language. There are near infinite, actually more than near infinite, there are infinite possibilities for our combinations of letters to form words and our combination of words to form sentences. Not quite the same for body language. There's a small set of tactile or visual body signals in our everyday behavior, and it's very hard to increase this. It's not as simple as just adding a word to a dictionary that people could go online to refer to. Those are more socially and culturally ingrained over a long period of time for it to become normalized, that widening your eyes means surprise. That takes like generations to settle on stuff like that. Like imagine if you were asked to invent a new facial expression or manual gesture. Like you start going through your head like, oh, that one's been taken already. I could go like this. Nope, that one's been taken already. Or nope, that doesn't mean anything. And they can't really be combined in the same way words and sentences and letters can, so that they can never reach a level of expression of meaning beyond just those very basic primitive meanings. So displacement and productivity are two properties of language that differentiate it from body signals. And then the third one is the duality of structure or double articulation inherent to languages. This means that language operates on two levels of structural organization. On the first level, you have the existence of letters or sounds, which have no intrinsic meaning in themselves. Like you can't ask, what does S mean? What does W mean? They possess no meaning in themselves, but then once they're combined to form that second level of the structure, which is when those letters or sounds are organized in ways to form elements that do convey meaning, such as words and phrases and sentences. Like S and W may not mean much in themselves, but you throw an A in between them and now you got saw. And now that has all sorts of meanings. I saw something, or seesaw. So this double level of structure isn't present in body language or animal communication. Those things operate on just one level. Like as soon as you make a facial expression, it's automatically possessing and sending a meaning. It's not like that facial expression is built up from different composite elements, the same way letters are the composite parts of the whole of a word, which is given new meaning once it forms that whole. So these three properties of language is what allows us to have the potential to express ourselves and our situations and our ideas in infinite ways and with great complexity. So now that you know these three properties of language, you can ask for yourself, you can look for yourself at things that may be construed as a language and see if they meet these three requirements that Crystal listed. And you'll find that for a lot of them, it's only the formal, official, spoken languages that meet all these requirements. But there are still some modes of expression that kind of blur the lines between mere communication and language proper. So whistling, for example. Whistles are one of those things, human whistling is one of those things that's kind of akin to body language in that it's used to express basic primitive meaning, like getting someone's attention or being impressed by something. I can't whistle, so this probably isn't the best example for me to be explaining, but you've heard the traditional uses of whistling. However, there are some proper languages in which whistling and whistle sounds are like letters in that language, and they possess all the same complexity as would any other language. And when whistle sounds are used as if they were letters that can be arranged on that dual level, then it allows people to talk about things other than their immediate surroundings through whistling. So that in some use contexts, whistling does meet all three requirements to be considered a language in its own right. Granted, there are very few communities that still use whistling as a language like this. And the fact that I can't whistle leads me to a question of like the exclusivity of language and possible barriers to access for some people. And it gives me empathy for people with speech impediments in other languages. It's very much the same case of someone being maybe physically unable to make all of the sounds that are part of that language, and that could exclude them or limit them in very real ways. So now that we have a language of language, let's converse about conversation. So conversation on paper, in theory, is very different from how it often manifests itself in daily practice. There's a stereotype that conversation occurs in complete sentences with well-defined turns and participants carefully listening to each other and producing balanced amount of contributions. But the reality of most talking situations is that people often interrupt each other and kind of share sentences and finish each other's sentences and don't always pay attention to everything that's said. And it's typically not nearly that even or balanced. It's often very asymmetrical in terms of how conversations practically play out. However, underneath all the chaos and apparent randomness of our everyday conversations, there's a bit more structure to these activities in which people tacitly operate with the base of certain conventions and unspoken rules. So you may not be consciously aware that you're following these rules and these structures of conversation. It's more of a tacit, implicit, underlying thing that kind of keeps us roughly in line with what our culture stipulates are the normal, regular ways of going about our conversations. And familiar to us, Crystal uses the analogy of a chessboard and a game of chess in which conversations, at least it seems, have a beginning, a middle, and an end game. The participants are making their moves on the chessboard of a conversation according to the rules that are allowed for each piece. But that's really where the analogy ends, if it ever really began, because you could argue that conversations don't always have a beginning, middle, and end. And it's not a game in the sense that there are winners and losers of a conversation. It could be mutually satisfying and fulfilling for all parties involved. And just like language is productive, conversations are productive. You're not as much limited from the start by your position in the conversation. It's a lot more free flowing and generative of new possibilities within the conversation. With that being said, there's a lot more structure to a conversation than we may consciously realize. There's a lot of ritual in conversation that we just take for granted as something that's natural. So this is a good opportunity for you to take a look and examine your own conversations that you have today as you're watching this, or maybe recently in the past, or soon in the future. And think about maybe the beginning and end of the conversation, the socially acceptable conventions of a greeting. For example, I still feel awkward regarding the whole handshake dilemma in the middle of a pandemic, where it's just been ingrained in my muscle memory to reach out and extend my hand in greeting someone. It's just become this unconscious ritual that I've become so accustomed to participating in. I wonder if you've had similar experiences before or during the pandemic where you tried to extend your hand or someone tried to extend their hand to you, and there was just this awkward conflict of expectations for the greeting. Or take the ending of a conversation. How do you end a conversation? I've often been in like three people conversations where the other two people go off on a topic that I have nothing to contribute to, something that I have no knowledge of, and I just feel kind of awkwardly left out. And I look at my watch and it's like, I need to go, but how? Like, I don't want to interrupt them, but also I don't want to just leave without saying anything. How do I depart from this situation in a socially acceptable way? Sometimes I play into the humor of that awkwardness of the situation and just announce, I'm leaving now. But that's only with people that I'm very comfortable with. In terms of other people who you want to make a better impression on, you'd have to be more strategic and subtle in your communication of meaning that you have to depart the conversation. And not just the beginning and the end, but what about the middle in terms of like the topics that are chosen for conversation? Again, do you have an experience of maybe you introduced a topic that you thought would be well received and everyone was just very uncomfortable with it, or vice versa? Did someone just in the middle of a casual small talk or conversation just start talking about politics or religion? Like, there seems to be a common consensus, again, an unwritten common consensus, that certain topics are safe, such as the local sports teams, the weather, or someone's pets, because they always love talking about their pets. But then there's several unsafe topics. And again, there's a fine line. Like, you can talk about some aspects of a topic, like where do you work, but you can't ask them how much they're getting paid in that job. And again, it also depends on your closeness with those people. Maybe you can gauge the situation and say, okay, these are all my close friends. I can bring up something a bit more personal. And just about with anything in this course, there are cultural variations too, in terms of the types of greetings, such as handshakes versus bowing, and the types of acceptable departures. There's literally something called the Irish goodbye, where you don't say goodbye, you just don't say anything, you just leave, and that's referred to kind of in a derogatory way as the Irish goodbye, which is kind of confusing to me because as an Irish person, every Irish person I've met has been overwhelmingly friendly. And anytime someone has committed the Irish goodbye, it's been from someone who isn't Irish. And then in terms of the topics of conversation, the middle, the meat and potatoes of the conversation, that can also vary in terms of acceptable topics to broach depending on your cultural context. So some rules must be loosely present, or at least some sort of common understandings must be in place. Otherwise, conversations will just continually break down into disorganized jumble of interruptions and talking over each other and just not really getting anywhere meaningful. And these rules usually relate, or at least the common understandings usually relate to turn taking. Whose turn is it to talk in a conversation? This is how we ensure that people don't talk over each other and talk simultaneously. It brings a bit of order to the potential chaos of a conversation. Obviously, this is present in formal situations, such as debates, where you literally have a turn, a predefined turn to talk and make your point, and then the other person in the debate has their turn to rebut your point and make their own point. But this often happens in informal conversation too, without us really being aware of it in that explicit way. The cues that we make for taking turns are much more subtle in an informal conversation. Participants of a conversation take turns holding the floor, so to speak. So that's their turn to talk and participate. And then they signal to each other in subtle ways when they're about to conclude their turn, and that others will be allowed to speak. So they can hint in their speech by saying, so anyways, or last but not least, or and finally. Those are all clues that the person whose turn it currently is about to end their turn, and then other people will get their turn. And not just semantically, not just in the words we choose to use, such as so anyways or last but not least, but also something that we'll talk about in a few slides about our pitch, our loudness, and our pacing. So not the words themselves, but how we express them. Our pitch might get lower as we're finishing our turn, or we may talk a bit more slowly to give others a chance to recognize that our turn's about to end. Or eye contact is another one. When someone's about to end their turn in a conversation, they could look more intently and maintain more constant eye contact with the person who's expecting to speak next after them. I'm terrible at giving cues about when I'm about to end my turn. I usually just stop talking all of a sudden, and there's usually an awkward pause where a few people are like, is he done talking? Is he done his turn? Are we allowed to talk? So this reading illuminated some of my own social ineptness and social awkwardness. I always just thought that's a part of life to be awkward, but it turns out I'm missing some important social cues to make conversations smoother and less awkward. And I'm wondering, after you hearing all of these different cues for signaling when turns are about to end or begin, such as body language or eye contact, how do you think this affects Zoom conversations? Like, so many of our conversations nowadays are being conducted on Blackboard Collaborate Ultra or Zoom, and how does that affect our ability to know innately when someone's turn is about to end or begin? Because you don't really have that eye contact. When you're just a bunch of boxes on a screen, you have no idea who the speaker is looking at to kind of clue them in that they're the next to speak. Like, embodiment and body language is such an important supplement to conversation and the flow of conversation. So when Zoom and other online mediated video conferencing software sever that connection between the body and the voice it's projecting from, you can lose a lot of these subtle clues and cues on how to order and structure and give order and structure to a conversation. And not just the cues that the person speaking is giving to those who aren't currently speaking, but vice versa. Even those whose turn it isn't currently to talk, they're giving cues that they want to be the next one to have a turn, taking the floor and speaking next. Again, it's so much more obvious to detect in person. Like in an in-person conversation, if I want to speak next, I can kind of lean forward a little bit, or do the whole, finger up, not a whole hand up, but just a casual finger, or nod your head more vigorously, or smile and make eye contact with the right people to indicate that you want to talk next. Again, apparently I'm oblivious to this because I get interrupted all the time. When I think I made it very clear that I want to be the next one to take a turn, someone just comes out of nowhere and absolutely steamrolls me and just starts blurting out and talking over me, and then I'm just like, okay, I guess I misinterpreted that situation. It wasn't my turn. It's just something that seems to come so naturally to other people, but I have a very hard time noticing these cues. And again, even on Zoom, I'll try to, I think, okay, no one else is talking, it's my turn. I go to unmute my microphone, but then in that moment, 3 other people unmute their microphones. And like I said, our conversations are the fabric of our everyday experiences. They build up to shape our worldviews. So if every conversation you have is like halting and staggered and awkward and just jumbled and hard to express yourself and get your ideas across, then you're going to see the world in a similar way and have a less ideal relationship with the social world around you if you can't interact with it in the way you feel you should be able to or are able to. And that can lead to a lot of frustration. Sometimes I feel like after an interaction, like I'm just misunderstood. Like I'm an alien in my own land. Like everyone else knows perfectly how to flow in a conversation, and I'm just struggling to get a word in. So an important aim of conversation analysis, which is what Deborah Tannen does, is to find out why conversations aren't always successful and smoothly flowing. Misunderstanding and mutual recrimination are unfortunately fairly common in that misunderstandings do occur, but instead of them being interpreted as misunderstandings, they're seen as blameworthy on the participants. So instead of just acknowledging that, oh, that was a bit awkward, but I think our conversational styles are different, we come from different cultures, we didn't really set expectations for how that conversation would go, so it's understandable that there would be some misunderstandings. Instead of thinking that, we just think like, oh, there's something inherently wrong with that person, or there's inherently wrong with me, and we tend to blame the person rather than the conversation. Crystal gives an example of a common misunderstanding that occurs in conversation between parties of different sexes in their use of head nods and the noise of mm-hmm while the other one's speaking. So apparently women nod their heads in conversation and say mm-hmm more often than men. And some conversation analysts, such as Deborah Tannen, have suggested that the two sexes mean different things by this behavior and they interpret different things from this behavior, which leads to a lot of misunderstandings. So apparently when a woman nods and says mm-hmm, she's indicating that she's listening to the other party and encouraging the speaker to continue, like mm-hmm, continue. But the male in the conversation may interpret it that the female is agreeing with everything that the guy is saying. So the intended meaning is I'm listening, but the interpreted meaning is I agree, which can lead to a lot of awkward conversations and confrontations and strife and fights and struggles in communication. Like the wife could ask her husband, why did you buy a jet ski? And the husband could say, you agreed. I was telling you about the jet ski and you kept nodding and saying, mm-hmm. And the wife is like, that doesn't mean consent. That just means I'm listening. So in practice, realistically speaking, we follow a large number of social rules, most of them unconsciously, that constrain the way we speak and write, such as norms of formality in terms of recognizing when a situation is more formal and requires politeness, such as showing chivalry to the opposite sex or reverence for people who are older. So pragmatics is a branch of linguistics which studies the factors that govern our choice of language in a given social interaction and the effects of our choices on other people's choices of language. So yeah, we have this whole structure of potential sounds and grammatical constructions and vocabulary that we can select and grab from to form meaning. But all of that reservoir of meaning is constrained by the practical situations in which we can apply it. So yeah, yo means hello. So technically you can grab from the reservoir of that long and take the word yo, the letters Y-O, and insert it into a greeting. But you have to make sure that the realistic situation you're applying that isn't to someone who may frown upon your use of referring to them with the greeting of yo. So you might be able to say yo to your friend, but you might be more constrained and thus precluded from saying yo mom or yo boss man or what's up professor. So this once again denotes the difference between langue, as in the general structure of a language from which you can pull meaning, and the actual everyday speech acts in which they're put into use, the parole. These are the specific utterances that are allowable manifestations from that general structure and general rules of a language for all practical purposes. So all interactive linguistic performances are constrained by pragmatic, practical considerations. And pragmatics is the field of linguistics, the subfield of linguistics that studies all these principles and practices underlying our linguistic acts. Another example of the pragmatic use of language is the strategic and subtle ways that we get things done in less direct or confrontational manners. So some speech acts directly address a listener, but the majority of speech acts in everyday conversation are more indirect. Again, from that reservoir of the structure of language, there are so many different ways that you could ask someone to do something. The most direct way is not always the best way, such as shut the door. Like, yeah, that's the most efficient use of words to clearly and directly command what you want done from the other person in this interaction. But pragmatically, that may be inappropriate in many everyday situations. It could be could come off to the receiver as very abrupt and rude. So instead of just commanding someone to shut the door, you can ask, could you shut the door? Or say that you'd be grateful if you shut the door, or would you mind shutting the door, or it would help to have the door shut, or it's getting cold in here, hint, hint, or shall we keep out the draft? I'm not sure of the grammatical coherence of that one, but Crystal is a linguist, so I'm assuming it's okay. These, of course, leave open more room for interpretation. Like, you could be hinting at them, like, hey, it's getting cold in here, and they could be like, yeah, it is getting cold in here, and just be completely oblivious to your implicit request for them to shut the door. So strictly speaking, it's not the most pragmatic way, but it is the most pragmatic way, because at least you're not hurting anyone's feelings or damaging the relationship between those two participants. It may take a little longer. Some things may get lost in translation, but at least the two sides won't resent each other. And the Tannen reading gives another example of this, where a woman is in a place where a man is smoking and there's a no smoking sign right there. And instead of saying to him, you aren't allowed to smoke here, put that cigarette out, she says, I'm awfully sorry, but I have asthma, so your smoking makes it hard for me to breathe. Would you mind not smoking? And then the way she frames it is like the man who's smoking is doing her a favor by putting it out. He doesn't feel like he's being scolded for not following the rules. Rather, he feels like he's doing something nice for someone else, so he feels good about himself. And she gets what she needs to get done. Who knows how he would have reacted if she just said, yo, check the sign, don't smoke here, put that out. He could rebel against that and just say, no, I'm going to smoke 2 cigarettes in a row now, or 2 cigarettes at the same time. So I'm curious about your experience with indirect conversational tactics such as this. If you can recall times that you've employed them in the past. And do you feel that it's okay? Like there's a lot of gender norms imbued in situations like this, where maybe if it was another guy telling the guy not to smoke, he could be more direct and the guy would just respect that guy's wishes and put it out reluctantly. So for the women in the class, do you feel like you have to be more indirect in making a request or trying to get things done? And are you okay with that? Or do you think there are some gender inequalities and disparities in terms of our potential for action within a conversation and the things we are allowed to say and potentially aren't allowed to say pragmatically?